Why did you want to be an astronaut?
It's actually a little bit harder than you might think. If you were to ask a lot of the other astronauts in our office, or if you'd ask cosmonauts, a lot of them could tell you that since they were children, they knew they wanted to do this. For myself, anyways, I've been interested in space and astronomy and science in general since just before my 8th birthday, when Neil and Buzz landed on the moon in Apollo 11. So that made a huge impression on me, but to be honest, it didn't make me want to be an astronaut. And I think that has more to do with the way that the way that I looked at myself back then. I didn't necessarily think that I was smart enough, capable enough. Astronauts, from my viewpoint as a young 7, almost 8-year-old back then, were sort of on another plane entirely. About that same time, I saw kind of a silly Walt Disney movie called The Boatniks, which nobody would even know how to find or look up right now. And probably was, I think it might have been the next year. And that also made a big impression on me. And it was my first exposure to an organization called the Coast Guard. And it was this silly story about this fellow who graduates from the Coast Guard Academy, goes to a ship, and has this whole series of misadventures. But from that point on, as long as I can remember, I wanted to be in the Coast Guard. I wanted to do search and rescue. And now I pursued that, finally, ultimately made it to the Coast Guard Academy. I became a pilot, and I had a wonderful career in the Coast Guard. But all throughout my entire life, I was always interested in space, and built telescopes and followed the space program. And it wasn't until I was already in the Coast Guard flying helicopters that another Coast Guard pilot named Bruce Melnick got picked up for the astronaut program. And it was sort of this conjunction of two interests that I'd always had, and I thought, well, geez, maybe I should try and see if I can become an astronaut. And after 6 years and 3 attempts, I managed to make the transition, and have had a wonderful career here as well. I did take a couple of years off after my last mission and go back to the Coast Guard Academy, and got a chance to be an educator and teach there. And it was kind of an opportunity for me to return to my roots, to be around young Coast Guard folks that are trying to figure out what they want to do in their future, brush up on science and engineering again, and basically give back a little bit from an organization that gave me such great opportunities to do the things I've been able to do.
I want to learn some more about the details of the background. We start with your hometown. Tell me about what it was like for you growing up in Tallinn, Connecticut.
Right, Tallinn, Connecticut's it's a small town. It's probably one of the, I guess, bedroom communities of the urban area of Hartford and so forth, and lots of woods. A great place for kids that want to just go out and have adventures and go exploring and so forth. The school that I went to, the high school, fairly small, a couple hundred kids, graduating class, and everybody pretty much knew everybody else. Was very fortunate to have some great teachers that inspired me. One of which was my physics teacher, and who taught me how to build telescopes. His name was Jim Harvey, and that was sort of, it probably reinforced my interest in science that I'd always had, before that point. It was a good place to grow up. It was a safe town, lots of great friends, and lots of very good experiences. Difficult to see from space. It's very easy to pick out Houston. It's very easy to pick out Hawaii, Alaska, Cape Cod, where probably my new hometown is, I guess, if you will. And Connecticut's quite a ways from the Long Island Sound area, but if you know roughly where it is, or Tallinn, Connecticut is, you can pick it out. But it's a great place. My folks still live there.
So you grew up there and you went to high school there. From their point on, give us the thumbnail sketch of your career in your education and your profession, which for the most part is the Coast Guard then.
Right. So I graduated in 1979, and I applied to the Coast Guard Academy in my junior year, and actually I didn't get in the first time, and that was probably an important lesson, and it probably carried through in my future, decade or 15 years or so later, applying for to the NASA program. But I didn't get in, so I went for 2 years as a physics major to Fairfield University, and but still really wanted to get into the Coast Guard, and reapplied and got in, and went there for 4 years, graduated with a degree in electrical engineering. When I decided years ago that the Coast Guard was something I was interested in, I had this vision in my mind of being on Coast Guard's small boats and charging out in the surf, in the storms, and rescuing people. And it's kind of an interesting thing, because when I finally did ultimately get to the Coast Guard Academy, and like all military academies, you show up and you have a very grueling, tough first summer as you learn the military way. It's like boot camp, and you learn a little bit about the service and so forth. Probably that first or second night I was there, there's a small book you'll get called The Running Light that tells you about all the things you need to be able to respond if an upperclassman approaches you, as a freshman or fourth class or a swab. And also in that book it talked about the various Coast Guard ships, small boats, and turns out airplanes and so forth. And I remember flipping through this after doing a couple hundred push-ups one night, and I was studying it, and I remember looking and realizing to my shock and dismay that the only people that can't be on Coast Guard small boats charging out in the surf and storms are Coast Guard officers. The enlisted force does that. Petty officers are the ones that do that job. And I remember thinking to myself, what am I going to do now? This is ultimately what I was. Exactly, why am I here? And then it was a couple of pages later in that same book, and it had ships, larger ships, and so forth in the Coast Guard. But as an officer, you probably won't get a chance to do hands-on search and rescue and actually be the person who's, directly saving somebody. You'll be in charge of ship of 100 or more people that are doing that. And then after that, they had Coast Guard airplanes, C-130s, and then ultimately there was a section about Coast Guard helicopters. And until that point, I have to admit, I didn't know that the Coast Guard even had an aviation component. And as I read about it and learned about it, I realized that if you wanted to be the person to actually be directly involved in search and rescue, the best way to do that as an officer anyways is to be a Coast Guard helicopter pilot. So I'd never thought about aviation until that moment, and I never thought about anything but that after. And so I graduated in 1985 and went to a ship. Spent a year and a half on one of those large Coast Guard ships, doing drug interdiction and fisheries patrols and a little bit of search and rescue and a couple of military patrols in the North Atlantic. And as soon as I could, I went to flight school. And the Coast Guard sends their people, their future pilots, to Pensacola with the Navy, and learned how to fly airplanes, learned how to fly helicopters there. And then the Coast Guard taught me how to fly H-3s. And I had a series of different assignments: Elizabeth City, North Carolina; Cape Cod, Massachusetts; and Sitka, Alaska. After my first tour, I went ahead and pursued, within aviation, we also have an aviation engineering subspecialty. So if you want to be the engineering officer and help basically oversee the maintenance of the airplanes that you're flying, and work directly with the great folks that turn wrenches on those planes, and to run the hangars and the facilities and the engine checkout stands and all that. The best way to do those kinds of things is to get into aviation engineering. And I was an assistant engineer in Cape Cod, and I was the engineering officer in Alaska. And then I came to NASA from that tour.
Now you're here flying in space, and that's a job that's got some risks associated with us that are different than the Coast Guard, and certainly different than what most people run into in their daily lives. The question becomes, or seems to be, well, why do it?
Yeah.
What is it that you think that we're getting as a result of flying people in space that, in your mind, makes it worth that risk?
Well, it's an interesting thing. If you look at it the way we, if you consider a search and rescue mission, for example, in the Coast Guard, and you think about it this way: sometimes the weather's really bad, sometimes there'll be a big storm, and that's why the people that are in distress are in distress. And so there's sometimes when Coast Guard airplanes and Coast Guard crews fly out in conditions that would not be what you'd ever experience in an airline or anything else. And you do that with the mindset that you're going to do whatever you can to manage the risk. That you're going to be, that number one, the crew is going to be very well trained. The airplane or helicopter is going to, or ship is going to be very well maintained, and that the crew real time during the course of the mission is going to be very careful about what they do and make sure they don't put themselves in harm's way any more than necessary. But the trade there is there's a strong probability that when you're done that night, there'll be one or several people that are alive that otherwise would not be. So it's a very concrete, stark calculus that you're able to do. And if you're talking about climbing on a rocket, a space shuttle or a Soyuz, or living on board station for 6 months, it's a different kind of a thing. But you're not. To me, it sort of depends on your long-term view of what's right for the human species. You're not doing a mission with the idea that you're going to save a life. You're going to do a mission with the idea that you're going to save the future of a species, and that this is where humans belong. So, but it's got to be something that you seriously consider. It's got to be something that your family and you collectively agree to. It's not for everyone, but I hope for the long term it's at least for someone, because it's an important thing for us to do.
You're getting ready to launch to the International Space Station to be part of Expeditions 29 and 30. Dan, give me a summary of what are the goals for the mission, for your time on orbit, and what your main responsibilities are going to be when you get there.
Okay, I think the primary goals for our Expedition 29-30, in contrast to maybe some of the preceding ones, are the space station assembly is now complete. The bulk of the assembly is complete. So we're essentially transitioning from a period of assembly being the primary objective and the primary operational constraint to utilization now. So the idea is to let the space station do what it was intended and what it was built to do, and that is to do cutting-edge research.
And your job?
And my job as a member of the Expedition 29 crew, flight engineer on that crew, and as commander of Expedition 30, first and foremost, I think, is to make sure that we're safe, that everybody on the crew is safe, and that the space station is operated safely. And then beyond that is to be a technician, to be a lab technician, to be a collaborator with the scientists on the ground doing the science, and to do that utilization. And that's in a bit of a contrast from the kinds of missions I've done before in the shuttle, but I'm really looking forward to it.
That's not only have you been there before, but now the station that you're going to get to is different than the one that you last saw.
Right.
It'd be a pretty dramatic change.
And I'm really looking forward to the first view from the Soyuz as we approach the space station. And my first mission, it was before we had a permanent expedition on board, and the space station consisted of 3 modules: the service module, the functional cargo block FGB, and the Node 1, the first U.S. element. And it was still impressive even at that stage. But and then my second mission, in STS-115, to me, it was absolutely huge, expansive in comparison. But now it has grown probably another third at least beyond that, probably more than that, I guess, when you consider all the solar arrays and truss elements that have been added to it. So I'm looking forward to the view. I understand by all reports, the folks that have been there, that there are some really spectacular areas on the space station from the perspective of just humans living there, the cupola being one of them. And to be able to live and work in the huge volume of the space station, for 6 people, I think it's almost lonely sometimes. It's so big.
Well, give us a sense of what it's like now. Some of the comparisons are that the habitable volume is like a 4-bedroom house or more. What's there at the station that you're going to arrive at?
Well, space station's it's a laboratory. It's a house where the crew lives and works. It's got its own electrical power system, command and data handling system. It's got a wastewater processing system and a full-up environmental control system, thermal control system, and it's also a research laboratory. So all in all, if you were to take the entire space station and gently set it on planet Earth, it would cover about 2 football fields in area. So it's absolutely expansive, very, very large, and much larger than the last time that I saw it during STS-115. It's manned permanently by 6 crew members, and we've got Although the laboratory is so big, you might be tempted to say that 6 people aren't enough to operate all of it. In truth, a lot of the science that goes on board Space Station is actually operated 24/7, 365 by teams of scientists all around the world, hundreds of them, and in laboratories and institutions, and a lot of that work is done independent of the crew. We're there to help if needed. We're there to, in some cases, help iterate with the science and collaborate with the scientists, and in some cases just operate as a laboratory technician changing out samples. But it's, in addition to those kinds of things, it's got a gym so that we can keep healthy in space, and it's got some rather small, what we call crew quarters, or bedrooms, if you will, and so it's got all the accommodations that you need to keep a crew healthy and productive in space and do the science that the station was intended for.
Let's talk about the science. As you say, it was the reason the station is there is to do science research. Now there are 6 crew members, and there are more laboratories, so you can do more science. A big part of the science is to find out how people are affected by being in that environment, and you guys are the subjects for that research. Give me a sense of what you do in some of this research as we find out how a microgravity environment impacts human function.
Well, I guess first and foremost I would say that to me, on a personal level, it's kind of interesting to see just how adaptable human beings are. So compared to the fact that we were evolved and developed to basically exist in a 1G or one force of gravity terrestrial environment in an oxygen and nitrogen atmosphere down here, with a very narrow thermal band that's comfortable for us, keeps us healthy, and so forth. And the fact that we can go from those kind of conditions and then live in space, in microgravity environment, and in a place that's absolutely inhospitable, absent the protection of a spacecraft to human beings, that we can live there for a long period of time, is a very interesting and a very kind of an uplifting sort of thing. Our inner ears are designed to basically keep ourselves oriented here on planet Earth. Some of those mechanisms, for example, the otoliths or the linear accelerometers in the inner ear, in space do not work at all like they do on planet Earth. Here they help us orient ourselves and know where down is, if you will, and they have a function that allows them to basically detect tilt. In space, absent the permanent 1G acceleration vector of gravity, which in space is counteracted by centripetal force. Absent that, those become exquisitely sensitive, but they no longer sense tilt. What they sense is just the tiny little bumps and jostles that we experience as we move around Space Station. And the semicircular canals, which are rotational accelerometers, which allow, that basically have a feedback loop that allow our visual field to be stable when we turn our head, for example. In space, those operate exactly the same. And just how that mechanism works, how those things play into our ability to maintain spatial awareness in a microgravity environment, kind of an interesting thing. For the first couple of days in space, typically, it's a little bit difficult for some crews. You don't necessarily feel all that well as gradually your balance system kind of gets recalibrated and adapted to the space environment. But there's a lot of other things that go on too. Our bones are just as strong as they need to be to support us without injuring ourselves here on planet Earth. Our muscles are just as strong as they need to be to do the things that we do here as well. In space, we don't need very, very strong bones to protect ourselves, and we don't need to have strong muscles to do the things we do up there. And we don't need to have very, very capable cardiovascular systems. So what happens is your body will do what it needs to optimize the resources it has, and what it means for us in space is we become deconditioned from a cardiovascular standpoint. We get a case of potentially a very debilitating case of space osteoporosis, if you will, and those kinds of things would be very problematic if we were to leave low Earth orbit and go to the moon long term, or go to Mars, for example. So one of the primary goals of the NASA research is to understand and mitigate those kinds of effects. You know, we go to space with the expectation that sometime we're going to come back to planet Earth, for example. So we'd like our bones to be strong and our muscles to be strong. So a lot of what we do is geared towards that. You can help some of those things, it turns out, by exercising a lot. So on space station, typically a crew member will exercise about an hour for cardiovascular every single day, and about an hour of strength conditioning every day. And we can also help mitigate some of the effects pharmacologically too, and there's a lot of studies ongoing to look at that. The various other mechanisms, some of them more subtle than that change during the time that we spend on space station. We collect samples, urine, blood, things like that, and those get returned to laboratories on the ground, and they help the scientists there with much more sophisticated laboratory resources to be able to figure out how to further mitigate those kinds of effects. So, in short, NASA's primary goal for the human research on space station is basically to make it safer for us to go further.
And since we want to go further, that's why we do this research now.
That's right, exactly.
Now, you're doing a lot of other kind of research. If the first kind, the human research, you're the subject for, in the other kinds, you're the researcher, or at least the researcher's assistant for scientists on the ground. And they're doing research in a lot of different scientific fields. What other kind of science work are you going to be involved with during your time?
Well, there's a lot of work that's done on space station that falls in the category of, I guess, what I would characterize as more as basic science. So, fluid physics, combustion physics. We've got a facility up there that basically will look at the processes of combustion, and with the goal being to figure out how to make combustion more efficient, to reduce pollutants here on planet Earth, to understand better how fire propagates in a spacecraft in a microgravity environment, so that we can make spacecraft safer in the future as well. On the fluid physics side, there's been some interesting things that have come out recently, in space, in general, the inertial forces involved in liquids, for example, in the action of surface tension and capillary flows, those are all in a very, very different balance relative to how liquids operate and how they behave here on planet Earth. Again, with the 1g acceleration vector force, being a key component here on planet Earth. If you remove that, you get a chance to look in a much more pure sense at how fluids behave. So there's one experiment that was looking at capillary flow and and these would have implication for designing cooling systems for microgravity environments, for fueling systems, things like that. And there was a very strange anomalous behavior. There was actually a bubble that ended up in one of these lines, and the crew on board noticed that this bubble was moving when it shouldn't. And what that caused is the researchers on the ground basically saw this, and it kind of put in question our fundamental understanding of the models and how these liquids behave.
Have to rethink the hypothesis.
Exactly. So it's a kind of an exciting thing. So what that did is now we've reiterated, and there's a new experiment on board to kind of push on that just a little bit more and see if we can refine our understanding. Now, it's maybe a little bit difficult to predict with things like that in basic science, that things that maybe aren't in the category of applied science, where you're trying to refine a technology, trying to design a vaccine or something like that. You don't know quite where those kinds of things are going to lead, but sometimes those end up being the most exciting things you do. And so that's one example. We have on board the space station the alpha magnetic spectrometer mounted on the outside of space station that I think as of July had already discovered 2 billion or captured 2 billion particles. And its primary goal is to look at, to detect antimatter, anti-helium, anti-carbon, and galactic cosmic rays. And these are particles that are originating, millions and millions of light years away from sources that are, outside of the Milky Way galaxy and even beyond our local group, our cluster of galaxies. And the goal there, one of the goals anyways, is to basically get a better understanding of the structure of the universe, and to figure out, for example, the nature of dark matter. So it turns out that the things that we see, if we look up at a night sky at night, the stars that we see represent probably on the order of a quarter or a third of the actual matter that has to be there. So if you look at how stars behave in a galaxy, the galaxies should all fly apart. If you look at how galaxies behave in a galaxy cluster, those should all fly apart. So if you look at the things, the matter that you can see that's bright, that's stars, or that emits in any part of the electromagnetic spectrum, there's not enough there to make those things behave the way they do. So one of the goals of the AMS is to try to figure out the nature of this, and it's pretty exciting. And it's a question that's been an open question for astronomy for a long, long time.
Those are some wonderful examples. There are other fields of study there too. Name off a few.
Well, we do Earth observation. We do a lot of work from the space station, both with handheld cameras, and we've also got an agricultural camera that's mounted in the laboratory window observation research facility, the WRF we call it. And we've got another camera that is not really necessarily targeted for cutting-edge science, but it's more geared towards educational kinds of efforts, and that's called EarthCam. And it's an opportunity for kids on the ground, middle school age kids, to basically plan and take imagery of various spots on the Earth. And it's more, again, it's not high resolution per se, but it involves kids, young kids, in the process of space station operations, and it hopefully inspires them to do science and math and pursue those kind of careers, because we need their energy and we need their help down the road. So the Earth observation piece, if there's a major storm, for example, or a volcano, the space station is at a kind of a unique vantage point to take pretty high resolution imagery of dynamic real-time events around the world. We've got lots of Earth observation satellites that are many, many tens of thousands of miles away from the surface of the Earth, and they can do imaging in fairly high resolution. They can do global imaging and so forth, but the space station gives us a chance, as we fly over the eye of a hurricane, for example, to take images right down the center of the eye and to give, get some information about the processes that go on inside of these incredibly dynamic, incredibly dangerous storms, and maybe help advance our understanding of those a little bit.
It's a lot of science work, and as you say, you spend time exercising for science, right, as well. What do you do with the rest of your time, with all the rest of your free time? What other work is there for crew members on board?
Well, I think for me, one of the things I'm looking forward to is onboard space station, with nearly 1 million pounds of space station hardware up there. Even though assembly is complete and it's new and very shiny and very impressive to look at, there are still times when the hardware does break down, and still times when we have to roll up our sleeves and break out the tools and do some work on it. And coming from my experience before I joined NASA as a Coast Guard aeronautical engineer and airplane maintainer, basically, to me that's going to be a lot of fun and a very neat thing to do in cooperation with the people on the ground. Space station's different than Space Shuttle in that respect. The Space Shuttle is a vehicle that, as we would fly it for the 2 weeks or so that each mission would last, should something come up and some issue hardware-wise would come up with the Space Shuttle, the crew was basically equipped and expected to be able to do some limited repair to stabilize the system to make it safe to return to Earth, and then we would give it back to these incredibly talented professionals who have spent their careers taking care of these things. So the professionals would do the actual repairs. They would remove the duct tape or whatever we use to fix things and do the real repairs. Now with Space Station, you're not going to bring it back to the shop. You're not going to bring it back to the people who built it. And so what we have to be able to do is the crew has to be able to do repairs typical in complexity, typical in difficulty to what people that have done it all their lives here on planet Earth have done. And to expect that we could just roll into that with very limited opportunity to train with specific kinds of repairs is a little bit tough. So thankfully we got a lot of help. We have the ability for the ground to literally look over our shoulder and watch what we're doing. We train crews differently. it's impractical to train the crew in what we would call a task-based sense, to teach them all the things that they would be expected to do on a 2-week shuttle mission. We can't do that same approach on space stations. So we basically teach a set of skills. We teach the crew how to operate all the various tools that we have. And we trust in luck a little bit that things will behave well, and when they don't, we trust in the skills of the crew and the help of the ground to be able to do some potentially, involved, very sophisticated kind of repairs. Personally, I look forward to that. Not that I will look forward to the space station hardware breaking, but I think doing that and learning how to keep hardware operating well in space is a key skill. It's something that once we leave low Earth orbit is going to be absolutely crucial to making ourselves a successful spacefaring people.
Yeah, because then you can't bring it back to the shop
Exactly
either.
right. We're always, even right now, if it's something small that breaks and there's no real way we can fix it, we probably, if it's not too big, probably can get it up on a cargo vehicle in a matter of a month or two after the issue. If instead you're on your way to Mars and you're 9 months out, you have to be able to potentially even fabricate parts and not just do repairs. So there's no, calling home and getting a part in the mail. It just doesn't work. So.
You mentioned a few minutes ago that you're going to be a flight engineer during the Expedition 29 portion of this mission,
right.
But you're going to be the commander of the International Space Station during Expedition 30 after Mike Fossum and Sergei Volkov, Satoshi Furukawa go home. How does that change daily life for you, being the commander instead of a flight engineer?
I think at a fundamental level it probably doesn't at all. I think everybody on station has got to be thinking about the safety of themselves and their crewmates and the safe operation of the station first and foremost, and then the other things that we do up there. So everybody that's up there is really well trained and very talented folks. I'm very fortunate. The people I'm flying with are among the best I've ever worked with. I guess perhaps, at least at one personal level, I will probably look at what I'm doing on station and how we do things and the more critical kinds of operations with maybe a little bit of a different mindset than I would before. When we first show up, when Anton and Anatoly and I show up on September 24th, we'll have some experienced folks in the form of Mike Fossum, Sergei, and Satoshi that'll kind of take us under their wings, and we will be, for the immediate near term anyways, we'll be a little bit clumsy. We'll be finding our way around, and we'll have folks to kind of teach us the ropes, and that's a very convenient and very important way, I think, that we've right now set up the staging of the crews on board space stations. We always have an overlap with the experienced crew, and that'll give me an opportunity to learn from them on the things that are most important, the gotchas, if you will, how to do certain tasks more efficiently, things like that. And then when we say goodbye to them, we'll have a short period of time when there's just the three of us, and then after that we'll be joined with Oleg Kononenko, Don Pettit, and Andrei Kuipers. That'll be up there, and we'll take them under our wings. And I guess in that time frame, all three of us, and maybe to a larger degree myself, certainly for the U.S. segment, will be a little bit more of an instructor. Maybe we'll be essentially teaching them how to live on board space station in its current configuration, although all three of them have been there before. And
in fact, Oleg and Don have both had long duration missions before.
That's right. So maybe there won't be quite as much teaching on my part for them, but I think when I look at all the things that we do on board space station, I think some of the things like spacewalks, like having visiting vehicles come to space station, those are some of the most critical things, and those I think are really important for us as a crew to have good situational awareness, to be tightly in sync with the ground, so that should there be problems, everybody's ready to respond as they should. So I guess for myself, that's something I think about a little bit at this stage.
The plan, as it exists right now, calls for one Russian segment spacewalk late in your increment. What's known at this point about who's going outside and what work they're going to do? Right.
I believe at this stage it's going to be Oleg Kononenko and Anton Shkaplerov. So Anton would be EV1, and he and Oleg are going to go out. As I understand it, and there is quite a bit of time yet before the EVA, so there's the luxury, if you will, of making changes to that. But one of the primary goals is to install some extra shielding on the outside of the surface module. to help protect from micrometeoroid orbital debris. And that's something that the entire space station, it's an important thing for all of the station to have good protection from that. And they'll also have an experiment they'll be installing on the outside of the service module. And I'm sure there'll be some other, smaller tasks, minor tasks that are in there, one of which potentially could be helping to put in place some provisions for a future Russian research module.
And the rest of you get to press your nose against the windows and watch them?
That's right. Exactly right.
You made reference earlier to different kinds of cargo ships that come up. Right now the station is getting supplied by ships launched from Russia, from Europe, and Japan. But there are some new cargo ships being developed under NASA's Commercial Orbital Transportation Services program that have test flights that are scheduled for later on this year while you're there. Fill me in on these new vehicles and how they mix in with the current fleet.
You bet. Well, this is a critical capability because with the retiring of the Space Shuttle, we've now lost the ability to carry very big loads of cargo to the station and to return cargo from the station. So what we've done is we phased into basically a new chapter here where NASA is going to solicit and contract with commercial providers to do exactly that. And so we've got two companies right now that have vehicles that were planned to visit during the stage of our expedition, one of which is SpaceX. Their vehicle is called Dragon. And the other is Orbital Sciences, and their vehicle is called Cygnus. And the Dragon vehicle will have the capability of bringing cargo to space station and also returning samples, for example, returning logistics and perhaps failed equipment or things like that back from station to planet Earth. The Cygnus is just resupply to the space station. So the way those two vehicles work is they will essentially fly up to the space station and station keep or fly formation essentially with the space station, and then we'll use the station's robotic manipulator system, the big arm, to basically track, capture, and then berth those to Node 2, one of the forward elements of station. And currently the plan, I believe, is for Dragon to come to station or to launch, I believe, in early December. So Cygnus, I'm not entirely sure, but it'll happen probably towards the latter part of expedition, my stay on station, Expedition 30. We also hope to have an HTV, a Japanese Hope Transfer Vehicle number 3, to have that third vehicle also come up. It, like Dragon, like Cygnus, we track and capture and berth it to one of the forward elements, the Node 2. And the Europeans have an automated transfer vehicle. We hope to see that as well, probably late in Expedition 30. And again, the resupply chain to space station is crucial. Now, we did benefit from STS-135 bringing up nearly 5 tons of logistics. So we have got a lot of margin right now to absorb perhaps some delays should they come up on those other vehicles. But I really hope to see them, and I hope we get a chance to catch them and put them on Node 2. Are
you going to be controlling the arm to go out and catch them?
I think so. Don Pettit and I will be working together. Andre Kuipers will be working with us as well, and that's the current plan right now. So.
Commercial cargo ships coming to the station is, I guess, a pretty clear example of how human spaceflight has changed from one man in a capsule 50 years ago to what we're doing right now. You and your crewmates are going to be the first people to launch from Earth since the completion of the Space Shuttle program. What are your thoughts about the contributions that the Space Shuttle has made to human spaceflight?
Right. Now, speaking from the perspective of somebody who's had the opportunity twice, anyways, to launch on a shuttle, to see the shuttles retired, it's certainly bittersweet. I would love to have them continue to fly long term. The Space Shuttle is exquisitely designed to do the things that it just got just finished doing, and that is to build the space station and to haul up very, very large modules in the order of tens of thousands of pounds, and to support EVA's spacewalks from the Space Shuttle as needed, and to use a robotic arm to attach these elements and so forth. And to lose that capability from the perspective of a pilot, somebody, or a flight engineer, mission specialist who's got a chance to fly them, I'm sad to see that go. But the reality is, I think this is a good thing because we're now transitioning, finally, we're looking beyond low Earth orbit. The Space Shuttle, for all its majesty and capability, was never designed to go beyond just a couple hundred miles from planet Earth. So if we want to go to the moon, if we want to go to asteroids and Mars, we need a new vehicle. And so that's what we're looking at right now. So I think we've probably got to the point where low Earth orbit access is safe enough. I would never call it routine, at least not for my lifetime, I think, anyways. But it's practical that commercial companies can do this, and NASA can now contract out that that service from commercial companies. I think that's appropriate. But I think it's NASA's job then to take the next step, to leave from low Earth orbit and go into deep space, for the true exploration kinds of missions. And so I think the retirement of the shuttle, whereas it's a little bit of a sad time on a personal level, it's the right thing to do if you want to be able to set the stage to go beyond that. And we need to direct those monies. We need to direct our efforts to the next step, and I think we're about to do that.
Well, tell me where the next step is in your mind. Where's human space exploration going to be in 20 or 50 years? And how's the International Space Station going to help us get there?
Okay, yeah. Personally, if I were to look at the long duration 50-year time frame, I believe that in 50 years we will have at least one and probably several bases on the moon, and humans will be living and working there all the time. It'll be a routine thing. We'll do that for research purposes. We'll do it for resource utilization, and we'll use that as a staging ground to learn the next lessons to go beyond. I think asteroids have an awful lot of promise. There's a strong argument to go there to understand the nature and characteristics of asteroids. Planet Earth, in its long history, has had a few run-ins with more than one of those, and it's certainly going to happen again. And for us to be able to characterize it and understand, the nature of asteroids is important. There's a lot of good science to do there. Asteroids are probably also a very good resource potentially for raw materials to make things in space. So asteroids, the moon, there are some what we call Lagrangian points. They're points around the Earth's orbit, and they're places where there's essentially a balance of the gravitational force of the Earth and the moon, for example, or the Earth, the moon, and the sun. And they're points where you can basically stage a spacecraft in deep space and be essentially at a place that's very remote from planet Earth. That may be in a very good place, for example, to do astronomical research, like the James Webb Telescope would, for example, be. I think it would be good to be able to do that, to visit those places. Those things, those kinds of missions are probably an order of magnitude easier than, I think, the ultimate goal, which is to go to Mars. And I think in 50 years, humans will, I certainly hope, will have been there, and hopefully will be there on a permanent basis as well. Planet Earth is a wonderful place, and it's spectacular to view from the space station. I think it's too small for the human species. Maybe not for just not from the perspective of number of humans, but for our imagination. I think humans, by their very nature, are outward looking, and I think it's in our destiny to leave this planet ultimately and to go other places. And Mars is a really great place to go. The space station is going to help us figure out how to go to the moon and do that safely. It's going to help us learn how to keep the hardware safe and functional for long periods of time, so that we know how to design it to go to the moon. The moon is probably a couple of orders of magnitude, on the order of 1,000 times closer than Mars. The moon's going to be a great place, I believe, to be able to test hardware so that we can then launch crews beyond to go to Mars, asteroids, things like that. So all of these are stepping stones. Space station, we have a toehold or a foothold in space right now, but it's not deep space. It's still largely shielded by Earth's magnetic field, but we still have great things we can do in low Earth orbit to figure out how to keep humans and hardware functioning well, so that we can do those next missions, safer,